All right, welcome back to another episode of the BAT podcast. Howard, Zach, and Alex here for episode number 30, guys.
Amazing. And for 30, the three of us in three different locations, at least a little bit of a milestone for me as well.
Yeah, back to remote. Hopefully the audio quality won't stir up too much controversy.
No, a real tribute to remote work that we're in three remote locations. Hope you guys had a good week. I'm stoked for episode 30. We got some neat topics. Man, I was invited this week to go to the Road and Track Performance Car of the Year event at Monticello Motor Circuit Raceway.
This is the way you're going to tell Alex and I we did not get invited?
No, but the thing is, it sounds awesome. You get to go up there, drive all the sickest cars for, on the track and around the back roads there. But I have already committed to go to my buddy's wedding in Philadelphia, which overlaps. So it sucks because now all of a sudden this Monticello Performance Car of the Year, P. Cody as they call it, sounds way more fun than this wedding that I got to schlep to on a train to Philadelphia. But what can you do?
Yeah, be honest. Are they going to last anyway? That experience at Road and Track will probably be forever, though. But I think you and I have the exact same helmet size. So if they need someone to fill in for you, I'm very available.
Back to back, Cayman 718, Ram TRX 1500, F8 Tributo Ferrari. I mean, who knows what they're bringing out there?
I want to slam curbs at Monticello on the Ram TRX. That sounds so awesome.
Man, Howard, I'm really jealous of that invite. Do you have any idea about what kind of cars are going to come out? Did they give you a teaser on that? Maybe you're not allowed to spill the beans on that.
Oh, you want me to see if that invite's transferable? It possibly is.
Yeah, I think Alex and I are going to have to bid for it between each other.
Totally have to duke it out. That's awesome, Howard. I'm really glad that you got that.
Okay, I'm looking at the list now because I am curious. Ram TRX.
I don't think it's like supercars. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe it's a little bit of everything. But
historically, on those kinds of best car of the year type tests, all the magazines have brought kind of an interesting selection. I remember back in the day, there'd be they'd bring an Integra at the same time, and bring an S2000 or a Lotus Elise, and then of course some supercars too, which I think is cool.
I've always been into these yearly supercar shout outs, for lack of a better term, but I would say in 2021 pretty much every performance car is a supercar. I mean, it's just eye-watering what numbers are coming out. So do you want me to go down the list of what you're missing out on, Howard?
Is this the list for this upcoming event?
I'm looking at 2021 roadandtrack.com, the contenders for performance car of the year right now.
Hit us with it, Zach. I want to hear.
Okay, 781 Cayman T, which is, I don't know, a little bit of a tweener trim model. I think it gets the lower spec engine, but I don't know, it probably has lighter doors, like a little interesting on that one. The new Mini John Cooper Works GP, which I'm actually pretty into those. I think those are sweet little city cars.
Probably has almost as much performance as the Cayman T, which does. I was looking at those the other day. They do indeed have the 2-liter, the base engine, but with like upgraded suspension and stuff.
I know, why not just spring for the 2.5 and the S? But I'll save my strong opinions for myself, I guess here. Anyway, the new CLA 45, which looks so, I guess with Mercedes right now, it's what size do you want? It looks exactly like the larger one. It's tough to tell in this image.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. I'd rather see my old college buddies than drive a CLA 45. So that I'll hang my hat on that.
The new Continental GT V8, which is pretty sweet. I could see you cruising to Michigan in that, Howard. Maybe not this year, but once you can get one CPO'd.
Ooh, Conti V8 Vert. That's one.
Coupe, baby.
Oh, coupe.
Driving in the fall. The new F-Type, which looks pretty sharp. This is the wild card, I think, for this year. The Polestar 1. Are you guys up on that?
Is that the sedan thing or is that the big coupe?
It's the big coupe. It looks like a retro 1800 coupe.
Yeah, those are stunning. Remember we saw those at the old BAT office when they were you guys there for that when they pulled up during like a press release launch to to charge up?
Yeah, looks fantastic. I was there at it's basically like a gas station for electric cars.
Yeah.
Pay at the pump and everything. Yeah, they look so fantastic. I'm curious how they drive, but for making a statement, pulling up in that thing, I don't know. That or the Bentley.
That or the LC. Zach, I know you're a big fan of the LC. I actually like the Volvo better than all of them in terms of looks.
Zach, I lost track. I just assumed like a private equity company bought the Polestar name and was repurposing it for a number of things, but I guess not.
Yeah, very versatile SEO on that one, I'm sure. M8 competition. It's hard to even give a thought on that car, honestly.
Is that a competitor to the Volvo? Is that like, are they kind of in the same bracket or not really?
I think that the 8 Series is what the 6 Series was, but maybe a little larger. Didn't they axe the 6 Series? It's the big BMW coupe.
Interesting.
Volvo's a little smaller. Then we got Ram TRX and the new GT500 Mustang.
Wow.
Anyways, that got me thinking then to a topic that I don't think we've ever discussed on the podcast, but which is very much relevant to our daily lives and roles that Bring a Trailer. And that's the whole discussion around mileage, and specifically kind of the obsession with low mileage on primarily later model cars, but kind of across the spectrum. I mean, obviously mileage in general is, such a primary factor in evaluating collectability and all that sort of stuff. So we can take this a number of ways, but the three of us definitely have some thoughts on the subject, and I'm sure the community does as well. So we thought this was a worthy discussion point.
Yeah, the community often has critical thoughts about cars that don't get driven. A lot of people feel very passionately that collector cars should get driven. I think all three of us feel that way. I certainly do. One of the things like that might help frame this, Howard and Zach, since this is your literal day-to-day, I'd be curious what you guys think about how mileage impacts value. Like how does it impact, what is kind of your thought as you evaluate cars that are low mileage in terms of how it impacts the value?
Oh man, yeah, late model cars, it's closely correlated to their values, and in part because it's pretty much the only distinguishable factor on a large selection of newer automobiles, right? If you're looking at 6 different SL55s and they all have good service histories with the ABC pump replaced, what actually differentiates those cars? It's really sort of their use and the number on the odometer, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I would say, interestingly, when evaluating cars, there's probably no single factor that guarantees a price premium more than documented low mileage. And as Zach pointed out, it is often for later model stuff kind of the primary, if only, differentiator among cars, right? People who have like 10 LaFerraris are all red. What does everyone want to know? Like, what's the lowest mileage one if you want to quote unquote buy the best? We always make an effort to not have kind of more special, higher dollar cars overlap. If we have similar cars in our pipeline, which we often do, we try to stagger auctions so we don't have overlapping auctions for competing cars. And what caught my eye this week is we have 2 Ford GTs. One has 1,000 miles. You might think that's maybe one of the lowest mileage examples we've listed, but no, we also have live this week a Ford GT with 3 miles. And so, 1,000 miles in the big picture, that's right. Low mileage, super low mileage, ultra low mileage. Then we got this 3-mile dark horse. And yeah, we're very comfortable having both those cars live because, they are kind of miles apart, pun intended, in terms of who might be looking at them.
Yeah, it's the ultra low mileage cars, those cars with the single digit or double digit miles on them are probably never going to get driven. And so to me, theoretically, somebody might drive the 1,000-mile Ford GT around the block or even put, 20 miles on it, or maybe even a couple hundred.
Everybody's got a high school reunion to go to.
Totally. But it seems hard to believe that anyone would ever actually drive that 3-mile car. And so, I kind of wonder, what you guys think about the kind of the difference between the values on cars like that, right? I mean, with a car that you're never going to drive, it's like there's some you can't even theoretically conceive of driving it. There's some amount of value, at least to me, taken away from the fact that all you can do is look at it. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, wonderfully articulated, Alex. I mean, some people just love to own something for the sake of owning it. That's mine. It has 3 miles. It's one of, 4 left in the world with mileage that low, and I like saying it, and it makes me happy to see in my garage. So I totally get that, and I respect that from a collector standpoint. For me personally, I think you and I are super aligned. We'd like to use them, man. It's like the point. Drive them.
I
Yeah.
think, people get, in the comment section of any, higher profile listing that's super low mileage, there's always the comments of what a shame it hasn't been driven. But, people enjoy cars, the experience of ownership in different ways. And if you love what you own and it happens to be a museum piece and you don't drive it, but you have other cars you drive, that's okay with me. I don't, it's like people who are wine collectors. I don't hear people saying, oh, you don't like, how do you have a cellar full of wine? You never drink any of it. I mean, maybe that does exist. I'm not that I'm in the wine world, but it's kind of owning something that has a use case, but you can also, just enjoy it outside of that primary use case. We could probably figure out other examples, but people have all sorts of reasons for owning what they do.
You driving your Nissan Versa around is basically like the wine collector sipping on Yellowtail on weeknights. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, also there's, part of this whole mileage discussion is one kind of, what cars are most kind of sensitive to mileage, and when does mileage stop mattering, and for what models, right? If we list a, 93 Land Cruiser with, 40,000 miles, that's noteworthy, but a 89 328 GTS with 40,000 miles, that's kind of higher mileage, for better or worse.
Or a Mark III Healy, nobody really cares what the odometer says because it's been rebuilt 2 different times over the last 50 years.
Right, and it stopped working for 10 years. Yeah, that's tricky. The older cars with ultra low miles are always interesting. From a kind of auction, like listing description perspective. So the folks who work on my team are thinking about this all the time in terms of, a guy who comes in the door with an E-Type and he's like, it's only got 5,000 miles, but it's a 50-year-old car and there's no paperwork or documentation on it. It's like, does it really have 5,000 miles? Hard to actually know about that. People always want to assert that the odometer is accurate, but, without any kind of story or paperwork to back it up, I'm always a little skeptical.
Right. Part of that is the changeover from a 5-digit to a 6-digit odometer, right? That's kind of in the discussion. On that note, Alex, I think, low mileage when it is advertised, also kind of subconsciously confers this absolute originality dynamic, which isn't always true, right? Like a car that has super low miles, but it was parked outside for 20 years. And so it was repainted and reupholstered. So, I think people want the originality component hand in hand with the low mileage. And when you don't have that, it's, and me and Zach do this every week, right? Like what's the discount? You got the low miles, but it's been repainted and there's this and there's that. So it's not always, the straightforward story that people hope it might be.
Yeah, the folks who are writing our BAT listings and who are editing them, they agonize over this stuff because, people do, buyers and sellers too. I mean, everyone in the car world values so much kind of originality and preservation, but it's so hard to confirm. And, so often we've seen people claim one thing and then, you find a document or somebody looks closely at a picture and it turns out that the claim wasn't true. Sellers particularly who have a vested interest in the sale price, obviously are very interested in making as bold a claim they can about originality or low miles. And, Zach was mentioning earlier that we like to drive cars, the three of us on this call. And I think a lot of folks, especially kind of younger folks who are interested in collector cars like to drive them, and I value it a lot. But it's maybe a little bit of a hot take. I actually really like the ultra low mile kind of preserved cars, especially if we can confirm that they've been sitting in some guy's showroom for 20 years, or we know where it was. So it's almost certain that the car does have 12 miles or 27 miles or whatever it is. We had a GNX, I think, with 7 miles on it or something like that. I actually think those cars are really cool, and I love seeing them come through, even though we know they're never going to get driven, because even when it's a mundane car, it's, maybe one of the last ones that exists in that condition. And so you really get kind of a glimpse back at the past in a way that
historical significance is so cool. It's like, oh man, that's the one. That's as good as that will ever be. That's the last bottle of that vintage from this year. And yeah, you can really enjoy it. So I always give a shout out to the guy that does that and then enjoys it slowly himself. But I'm a little curious also. Have you guys personally owned a car where you felt the mileage anxiety and like you were driving the value out of your automobile every time you started it up and took it out?
That's happening to me right now for the very first time. I bought this kind of late model rare 911, a GT3, and I crossed the dreaded 30,000 mile mark, and I bought it to drive it. And now I feel like when I use it for a mundane task to go to the store or just to drive down to see my parents, it crosses
it almost lowers your self-esteem. It's crazy how much your head is wrapped up in that number on the odometer. And I'm trying to start a support group online to help people that are going through what I am calling mileage anxiety.
Well,
so,
Zach, what Alex just said, you know what I'm going to say as far as the 30,000 mile mark, and you remind me every day. I've got a F355 with Berlinetta Ferrari with 29,000 miles and change, and it's so dumb, this thing about 30,000 miles and crossing over, but it is something that's not just in people's imagination, and I think it's so stupid. So
the best part in the Ferrari world is that you'll keep it at that exact same mileage, but still do another engine out service in 6 to 8 years.
No, I don't care. I'm just going to go drive. I'm just going to go drive at 500 miles one weekend and just close my eyes when it crests 30.
Just rip the Band-Aid off. Yeah, burn through a box of that great red wine you shared with us in Monterey.
Yeah, totally. Just blow.
Maybe you'll even smoke a cigar in it. Just really, really take all the value out of that thing.
But like, the flip side to it, Zach, is, I've had this same old Porsche 912 for over 20 years. And like, I don't give a shit how many miles I put on it. And it feels awesome, right? It feels awesome to have a car that you don't care about, beating on and using it and leaving it outside. I mean, that is an amazing thing. And
it's so liberating.
Yeah. I would kind of like the GT3 to be that way. It's awesome. But like, I at the same time, even as terrible as I feel, you're right, I feel like a total dude.
You just need one good curved wheel and a little bit of a dent in the driver's door, and then you'll be there.
Yeah, but then you fear the next dent. I don't know. It's a weird psychological thing that happens. It doesn't make any sense. I hate it.
But yeah, I think what we're getting at is you have to mentally commit to owning that. So the 912 you're going to have for the rest of your entire life and hopefully pass down to your children. And it's a harder mental commitment to own a high dollar object like that and pile miles onto it. But if you can get over that hurdle, oh man, that's pure nirvana right there. Just driving your nice car that you've lusted after for years on end and really enjoying it.
But yeah, no, to close the loop on what you were saying earlier, Alex, and to kind of take a page out of Miles Collier's book, the uber low mileage cars, they do become like an artifact, and that they are the best, surviving example of what that is, and the most authentic. And so that's, I think part of the discussion. But yeah, no, in terms of these kind of mileage thresholds, real or imagined, where, some level of collectability or value is somehow diminished when you cross over them. I don't know. In 10 years, is 40,000 miles going to be the new 30,000 miles, or, pick your moving target?
No, with F355s, it's always going to be 30. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. It might go the other way. It might become 19,000 miles. You can't go over 20.
Based on the threads on the F chat forums, 30,000, there's no going back. Sorry, buddy. But I'm a little curious on the other side of that. When do you guys see ultra low mileage as a detractor? And an interesting example of this, which I don't think you could say it detracted, but I expected to see it sell a little higher, is the McLaren F1 that just went through Monterey. Were you guys paying attention to that car?
This is the green one. It's like a one-off color.
This was, I think it may be verified as the lowest mileage example. It's 242 miles on the odometer. It sold for a very humble $20 million. But on a percentage basis, it's pretty interesting, one with factors of the car world and how much collectibles are going up. And that's, among the greatest sports cars of all time. Just about 5 years ago, a 10,000 mile F1 sold right around 15 or 16 million. So it's not quite the proportional ladder of seeing that car sell well and above because it had 200 miles. My speculation is whoever got it knows they have to do a bunch of service work because it's been sitting for 20 years. So I don't know. What do you guys think about mileage in general and being a detractor?
I mean, for the buyer of that car, I mean, this is, again, I'm just presuming, but like maybe people who buy an F1 actually want to drive it. I mean, every time you hear someone talk about a McLaren F1, they talk about how amazing it is to drive it. I mean, is somebody going to get in that and bring that V12 out, wind it out to 7,000 RPM or whatever? Probably not. So like, that's a lot of money to pay to not have that experience.
I think that's right. I think, yeah, it depends if the low mileage is a result of years and years of atrophy, and thus a huge service bill, then relative to the total value of the car. Like what comes to mind for me is Bonhams a couple of years ago had an amazing collection of Group B homologation cars that were all from somewhere in South America, I think, and they were all low mile and super original, but they'd all been sitting for 25 years. And especially with those kind of highly specialized, high performance stuff of any era, that's so expensive to work on, much less find people to do it. Like I think a lot of people would rather have a car with 20,000 more miles that was on the button and fully serviced with a service history file rather than something that's been sitting in a barn since 1983. So my mind goes to the how did it accumulate those miles or lack of miles, and what does that mean if you're buying it?
I mean, with that McLaren F1, like, why the hell even bother to service it, right? That car's never going to get driven, right? I mean, like, I think that probably happens with some of these ultra low mile cars, 20 years without a service, right? Like that car can probably actually never really be a runner, right? Like unless you're going to rebuild the engine, which then, ruins some of the preservation of the car.
It's quite the catch-22, isn't it?
It is. That's why I buy a car that you can drive. Like I guess that's where I end up at the end, even though I like the idea of looking at either an auction or in person, a car that's preserved, just to see, to imagine what it would have been like to sit in a DeLorean in 1981 or a GNX in 1987. I don't actually want to own that car. I want to be able to drive it.
Other interesting phenomenon, which gets back to sort of what we kicked this off with, is when mileage is no longer really special or a differentiating factor in terms of collectability. And I think no model embodies this better than the S197 Shelby Mustangs. So many people bought those around 2010 or so and put them away and then never drove them. And now having ultra low mileage on those cars is actually not particularly special because there's so many out there. They made them in reasonable numbers and a lot of collectors scoop them up to try and speculate on their future. So having
fantastic point. Yes, that S197, C4, C5 vets to a degree, cars.
What about Vipers? We were just talking about Vipers. Lots of low mileage Vipers with all these crazy special editions.
The Vipers are interesting because it's actually it's sort of beating what the Mustangs aren't quite achieving. People are really excited about Vipers with those mileage. But
what do you think is the difference there? Are the people who are buying the low mileage Vipers also want to sit on them? Is that why?
Well, the difference is, have you driven an S197? Have you driven a late model Viper? I think that's part of it. But I am also curious about where this hoarding mentality comes from. And I'm a little wondering if the generation that buys them saw all these preservation class, high dollar muscle cars selling in the early 2000s, late 90s, and then saw this as maybe a second opportunity to do the same. I don't know. It's interesting though.
Cars.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Howard.
No, cars with very high production rates, high survival rates. Yeah, the effect of low mileage when so many have it goes down. But people were doing that with buying them and storing them away with GNXs and Grand Nationals and IROC Zs, and so I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon, but it seems to attract certain types of cars. What were you saying, Alex?
Yeah,
well, it makes me think about the future of restoration, because so many of the collector cars from before the war, from pre-war, 30s, 20s and 30s, and then also 50s, 60s, even 70s, like those cars all got driven. And so the cars that are super collectible from those eras that trade at huge numbers, they're all restored. But 30 years from now, if all the 90s and 2000s cars were bought on speculation, like, is there going to be a restoration industry for Vipers, or is there going to be so many preserved Vipers that people don't really have to do it in the way that they restore old 911s or old Ferraris?
Yeah, who was on here? Maybe it was the RPM Foundation fellow, but he pointed out he always laughs when he sees repair shops that say, we specialize in every single model, right? So you're saying, does it become more specialized, or can you create a whole business out of being the go-to, Viper shop?
Yeah, or is there even really Viper restoration? Because if you want a Viper in 2040, there's so many preserved Vipers that you can just go buy that don't need to be restored, right? In a way that there aren't, like, there's not some like sea of 1970 911Ss sitting in collections with 12 miles on them. Like, those just don't really exist, right? There are probably a few, but most of those cars got driven. There was a different mentality when somebody bought a car like that in 1970.
Ooh, yeah, I like that you're getting on shifts in mentality of using sports cars.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, did anyone speculate even on like a Carrera RS? Were people speculating on those as being low mileage collectibles 30 years down the road? I don't think so.
The 1970s, famous for many things, but maybe the decade with the worst reliability for odometers.
Yeah, careful hitting the trip odometer button on your 1972 911 when you're driving down the road.
God, man, you're gonna get. Sorry, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Oh no, I didn't mean to derail us, but one other interesting dynamic of the mileage discussion, and this may sound like an oxymoron to many people, but the future collectability of electric cars, and whether you believe it will exist or not, Tesla Roadsters are really the sort of first, what's coming out to be like a truly collectible electric car, I would say, at least. And does mileage really matter on those at that point? Is it how much battery percentage is left in your iPhone at the end of the life cycle, or
well, and presumably those batteries go bad whether you use them or not at some point. There's like a shelf life on them no matter what. Something like, the rubber hoses on your.
And there's something way different. I don't think anyone has the same nostalgia for driving around the original battery pack that they do of winding out your 68 911S 2-liter to redline, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a really interesting dynamic. I would say on the Roadsters we've sold, mileage has not been particularly relevant.
No, it hasn't.
Is it related to the thing that Howard was talking about earlier, where it's the perceived mileage to me, like Howard said earlier, is related to not exactly that the car hasn't been driven much, but to its originality and to how much it's been preserved. So maybe that's what people will care about on these cars, that where there's lots of low mileage one, like has there been paintwork? Has it been hit? Has it been, preserved in the right way?
Right. How much vape has been used in this Tesla Roadster? I'm really excited for Elon to get off the ground, the Carroll Shelby dash signature on all the Tesla Roadsters.
Oh, man. I wouldn't put it past him. He'll totally be that guy.
If there's a guy to reenact that whole dynamic of signing the dash, Elon would be the guy. Shifting gears a little bit, it's rare that for me and Zach, in the course of our daily work, that cars get submitted that genuinely pique our interest in a new and meaningful way. But that
great way of saying we're dead inside, Howard.
That is precisely what occurred to me last week when a car was submitted to us out of New Zealand, of all places, which was a 1923 Mercer Series 6. And you'd all be forgiven if you don't immediately know what that is. Mercer was an American car maker. This particular model kind of looks like a Stutz Bearcat, if that is helpful. But it got me, and the guy that submitted it is super cool. And he pointed out that the builders of that particular car were the Roebling brothers, mostly famous for building the Brooklyn Bridge here in New York. And it really got me going down a rabbit hole of this whole history lesson. And Alex, I'm sure you're going to have a lot to share on this subject. But it really is useful if for any car enthusiast talking about whatever they're interested in, the kind of dawn of the motor car and the motor racing era was really driven in large part by kind of these, minted families from the Gilded Age, Alex, of the end of the 19th century. You talk about Roebling and Vanderbilt and Duesenberg. And for whatever reason, a lot of these guys, and it was mostly guys, were interested in cars and in boats and yachts. But the Roebling brothers, I was actually not fully aware that they had such a connection to cars and actually served as the president and were in the leadership positions of the Mercer Car Company. Obviously, they had a suspension bridge business and built a number of notable, famous bridges still standing today. The Brooklyn Bridge kind of gets the notoriety for them. But Alex, you're somewhat of an expert on this subject, but what can you tell us?
Certainly not an expert. I didn't even know that the Roebling family was involved with Mercer. I love Mercer racebouts, and I, always happy to talk Duesenbergs. I love early motor racing. But I am kind of a history buff and have read The Great Bridge by David McCullough, Pulitzer Prize winning historian David McCullough, which I strongly recommend to anyone. I've recommended it to a few of our colleagues, I think somewhat to their chagrin, but it's a really well-written book, history of building the Brooklyn Bridge, the first great suspension bridge. And yeah, the Roebling family behind that, and civil engineers, and I'm, kind of really important in, laying out the infrastructure for early American, transportation networks. And so unsurprising that some descendants of John Roebling were behind Mercer and other car ventures. John Roebling, the first famous Roebling, he was the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and his son, Washington Roebling, was the engineer who ended up kind of carrying out most of the construction in the 1870s. Washington Roebling had been a cavalry colonel in the Civil War. He fought at Gettysburg. I mean, just so many cool tie-ins to the American story with the Roebling family. He actually got the bends. This is Washington Roebling. He got the bends going down into the caissons that they sunk down into the riverbed to build the towers for the Brooklyn Bridge, and was ill and oversaw the end of the construction of the bridge from his riverside home in Brooklyn. And he lived until the 1920s. And it's probably his son, so probably would be his son, Howard. I'm not sure if you know this, who was behind Mercer, the grandson of the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge. Do you know how they tie in together?
The son and the grandson. John moved the company to Trenton, which is not coincidentally where Mercer was based, and started the Roebling and Sons company. And so the sons, as far as I understand, were not just playboys a la Lance Reventlow, that they actually were active in the business. And I actually believe Roebling was the primary cable contractor for the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. So once you start talking about this stuff, there's so many connections to be made. And Alex, was it Washington or one of them that was aboard the Titanic, and that's where they were killed, or which one?
I think it was Washington. Might have been one of the sons. I think it was Washington's. I think it was Washington's son. It was either his son or his brother, or maybe a nephew of Washington Roebling, who went down with the Titanic in 1912. That's right. And the big, Americans were skeptical. A lot of people were skeptical of suspension bridges. They looked spindly. They didn't look like they could hold up weight. Here we are, the Brooklyn Bridge doing just fine 150 years later. But John Roebling Sr. had to do a lot of convincing of folks that the cables were strong enough to hold up all the weight that would go across the roadway of the suspension bridge. And so the cable technique that he came up with, they used it on tons of suspension bridges. I didn't know about the Golden Gate Bridge connection, but somebody went down with the Titanic, like the Vanderbilts, connected, intertwined with important events in American history. The Roebling family was.
So to answer your question, the president of Mercer was John Roebling's son, Ferdinand, and his nephew Washington was the general manager. And it's not surprising, right? These guys had a lot of success with very complex engineering and technology building bridges. So it's no wonder that they wanted to apply their these concepts and skills and talents to cars and motor racing. And I imagine, building a car probably was much less complicated and dangerous than erecting a bridge, in 1880. And so it makes a lot of sense that they were, so inclined to dip their toes in the car world.
For sure. I mean, early metal work, right? I mean, the Brooklyn Bridge is interesting because it's got stone towers, right? Everything is iron and steel later. But they would have had experience with that, right? So there's some tie-in to building cars there, building strong but light structures. It makes total sense. Did they found Mercer, Howard, or did they buy it after it was already established? Presumably somebody named Mercer started the company.
I'm so glad you asked. No, their business partner was someone by the last name of Kusser, I believe. So much like the 20s, earlier than that, at the turn of the century, there was, as you know, hundreds of these uber small time car manufacturers, and most, I would say, were effectively kit cars and assembled cars at some factory somewhere on the East Coast or the Midwest of the United States, and literally hundreds. So Mercer started out as the American chocolate. I kid you not. No idea where that came from. I think maybe because it was the assembly location was a chocolate factory. I think that's actually the story. And it went through a few other names before the Roeblings bought out their partners and named it Mercer. So I'm sure those listening with knowledge of this, that was probably an uber watered down version. But you were right, Alex. The kind of iconic Mercer is, I think, that the 35R Raceabout, which was kind of their top of the line model. That was their, I guess, competition oriented vehicle, and that was kind of in the era of Stutzes and American underslungs, and that got me reading about the Vanderbilt Cup, which was, I think, the first international auto race in the United States, specifically geared and to motivate in this burgeoning, bustling kind of new car culture. Specifically, they wanted to attract all these or a number of prominent European manufacturers to come race in the U.S. and showcase what they had. And which Vanderbilt was it? William Vanderbilt II, maybe the grandson, but he was into yachts and motor racing, and he said, "I'm going to go start this race." And that was, of course, the first 6 or 7 events were on Long Island here in New York and Nassau County. They invited the likes of Durac and kind of some of these obscure French manufacturers who ended up being very successful. I think the first U.S. American winner was possibly a Locomobile in, I don't know, 09 or 10, but yeah, I mean, I'm only scratching the surface of this whole subject, but it is quite fascinating.
You can go so deep on all of it. And, the idea of industry in general being, much more cottage, building cars in in a small factory in your local town. Sometimes these early car companies are named after the little local town. I love it. I think it's really interesting. Labor was cheap and you had a lot of artisans who could build, who could do all kinds of interesting things. I mean, the fledgling aviation industry, very similar, right? You think of the Wright brothers and some of the other early pioneers, both here in the United States and in France, building kind of airplanes in their bicycle shop or in their garage, and making all the parts by hand. It's a completely different thing than what we have now, right? And like you say, hundreds of different manufacturers. Also an era when you're talking about early car racing or early aviation races too. I mean, it's a way to showcase this new technology to the public, but also there's actual real trickle down from competition into, advances for vehicles that the public are going to buy, which, really has kind of gone the way of the dodo in modern era. I don't know how much a modern Formula One car impacts any of the electric cars that you see driving around on the street. But in that era,
it directly impacts the energy drink you're sipping on.
Totally. But there's like real trickle down that you can see in a Vanderbilt Cup race or in, the early era of competition, right? And maybe even gets you excited about cars in general or airplanes in general, really bringing the technology to the masses.
That's right. And a fun bar trivia fact, we had talked about kind of what did a new Corvette cost in 55 as kind of a barometer for car prices and inflation and whatever else you want to assign to it. William Vanderbilt, Willie, as he was known, I think unlike the Roeblings, I think Willie was quite busy, mostly managing and finding a way to spend his inheritance, and cars and boats were a wonderful outlet for that. He started the Vanderbilt Cup in 1904, which happened to be the same year that in a Mercedes at Daytona Beach in 04, he set a new world land speed record.
Wait, can I guess? Can I guess before you say it?
Yes, Mercedes, 1904 Daytona Beach land speed record. What was his trap speed?
So there's that. I mean, there probably were steam cars in the Vanderbilt Cup too. There's that canoe-shaped Stanley Steamer race car that did around that time, maybe 100. I'm going to guess that the gas car is not as fast. I'm going to guess 90 miles an hour, 94 miles an hour.
Wow, Alex, that is very impressive. He was clocked at 92 miles an hour.
Oh, man.
Have you ever seen that Stanley Steamer, that like boat shaped thing that I think maybe was the first car to go over 100? And it may have been at Daytona Beach also. That thing is awesome. That's maybe 1906. Steam cars were faster than gasoline powered cars, or were at least could be faster for some period of time. I think that's the second time I've talked about steam cars on this podcast.
I'm impressed, Alex. That was very that was off the cuff, and all of your expensive education around history is really starting to pay off.
Yeah, Sonoma State University, and reading some David McCullough books. I will do one more brief aviation tie-in because it gets me excited. Glenn Curtis, later an aviation pioneer, who fought in court battles with the Wright brothers until their companies were forcibly merged during World War I. He was setting motorcycle speed records, and he had a V8 powered motorcycle, a very lightweight air-cooled V8, as I recall, which later was a great application, was applied to airplanes, right, where you want a powerful but light engine. And he was going, I think, 100 miles an hour on a very early crude motorcycle on beaches around that same time, which is pretty brave enough to drive a car 100 miles an hour right after the turn of the century, but imagine doing it on a motorcycle.
And interestingly, the Vanderbilt Cup trophy lives in storage at the Smithsonian here in New York City, but is not viewable to the public, and has not been for many decades.
How long does the Vanderbilt trophy go, Howard? Does it go after World War I, or is it kind of end with the war?
They did it through kind of the mid-teens, and then there were some breaks, and then I think it it was continued again in kind of the mid 30s for a few years. And then there was some kind of tributes to it in the 60s, I think, with some Can-Am stuff at Bridgehampton, which is a defunct, I think Bridgehampton's now a housing development, but was a super cool track on Long Island.
What did the race itself look like? It's a circuit of some kind, I'm assuming, and it's probably not purpose built. Is it on the roads?
I mean, the original event, which was I think 04 to 11 or 12, 1904 to 1911 and 12, was 25 or 30 miles on public roads around Nassau County on Long Island. And that was kind of the first instance where crazy fans, right, lining the streets, people running out in the middle of cars, fatalities with spectators getting hit. So, that was a phenomenon that started, quite literally with the very first races.
I would love to know the elapsed time or the average speed around that circuit in 1904. It would be fascinating. Yeah. I mean, probably 20 miles an hour. Another thing that's so fascinating about that era with all of these kinds of records for speed is how fast things advanced. I wish I had the numbers in front of me for Indianapolis, but right, think about, the first running of the race, 1913 versus, just 20 years later. I mean, you're never going to have the speed picked up so much, so fast, so quickly, and the technology changed so quickly. Just a super cool era. For all those reasons.
And I believe it was Ray Haroon that won the first Indy 500 race. But the last note about Mercer, their first year in kind of a committed motorsports program of the 6 main events in the US, they won every single event, 5 out of 6, except the Indy 500. So,
yeah, I don't. Now that come to think of it, I don't know if a Mercer ever won the Indy 500. That's interesting. But I know it was extremely dominant, something like a prototype 35, right? A car that won almost everything, the early raceabouts. There's a second generation raceabout, isn't there too? One that has more bodywork on it. The reason I love the original one is there's nothing there. There's just no fenders. It's like a chassis with a little bit of bodywork over the engine. And then it has that great monocle windshield that's clipped onto the steering column that's just right in front of the driver's face. I love that.
Exactly right. Early teens were the more primitive design with the fuel tank right behind the driver, and then later teens they had the more cycle fenders and bodywork. So that's right. Well done, guys. Episode 30. I hope that we will do 30 more in the next 30 weeks. I think that we will. And what else, Zach? And any final thoughts? We've gone from low mileage Ferraris to 35 Mercer runabouts to
it's Bearcats. I know, right? Just sitting on a call with a couple of history majors here. A little quiet in my corner. Sorry, I didn't have much to add. Things are good, man. Have you guys been driving anything lately? You not so much, Howard, New York, but
Zach, aren't you? Why don't you tell us what you're doing in 2 hours from now?
Oh, I'm gonna do the closest thing to endurance racing in my own life, which is drive I-5 from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And for those of you that don't know, that's sort of the main connecting highway between Los Angeles and Northern California. I think.
What are you driving?
Oh, I check the NSX, cruise as well. I've got my two fuel stops planned out. Hopefully do it under 2.5 minutes.
Harris Ranch, one of your stops?
I definitely select gas stations that have the lowest stabbing potential on I-5, which is crucial. I've got a great little setup right before the Grapevine with all that weird outlet mall that just built is. You know that area?
Yeah, I think it's called Tejon. It's right at the foot of the Tejon Pass.
Yeah, great, incredibly clean bathrooms, my perfect gas stop, grid up, get out there, find, cruise by some semi-truck psychopaths, and then find whatever Honda Pilot is also driving it 90 miles an hour all the way down to LA, and that'll be my bogey.
Oh, Alex.
One more hot take for this podcast. I know that's a hated route. I actually love that route. I love being out in the kind of middle of nowhere in the San Joaquin Valley. And you and I have had a couple great runs down, Zach, in pairings of cars. And I I love it. It's, it's for a routine drive. It gets you kind of out in the open and seeing the great American West. I enjoy it.
I love that too. And I'm just so motivated by the I-5 psychology of 2 lanes, wanting to go as fast as possible. And then you have the obstacles in the left lane that don't want to go as fast as possible. And then you have the semi trucks, which adds such an interesting dynamic because they need to pass occasionally. And then when you do, entire freight train builds up when one semi is passing at 60 versus another at 55. So you
the assholes who don't want to wait in line and they're trying to pass on the right and then cutting into the line. Oh man, there's so much human psychology out.
And then
Are you talking about Zach?
Hey,
about Zach that way.
I would never cut someone off and then drive 78 miles an hour right in front of them for the rest of I-5.
Well, Alex, Zach can put his NSX in 6th gear on I-5, but you can't do that, can you?
I cannot.
Now because I made you feel bad about the mileage on your F355, you got to bring Alex down too.
The I-5 is actually a great place for I know some people don't like the gearing on the early NSXs, but it's actually a really great place for that car because you can downshift into 3rd gear and do these nice long pulls to get around people. So that's actually where the super tall gearing on a 5-speed NSX kind of matters the least, or is the most enjoyable to use. But man, 1st, 2nd gear in Zach's car is like a whole different world than my car, even though the power is not that different.
Yeah, a lot of yelling about VTEC in my car, in my 290 horsepower V6 car.
All right, guys, we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening. Send us a note to podcast dad or in the comments. Free shirt if there's any actual descendants of the Roeblings listening to this. We'll mail that out to you, and we'll be back next week.